Housing crisis 101 hits Australia, UK, possibly New Zealand, and I know it's hitting America. What are the causes? What are the solutions? Just quickly off the top of my head. Okay, causes are multiple causes. 70s and 80s, houses used to be in this country 3 to 4 times income. They're now 8 to 12 times income. Now, 3 to 4 times income was doable on one income. 8 times income is only doable on two incomes. So 4 times income, one income. 8 times income is two incomes, but that's 4 each. So that forces the woman to go to work. It forces the couple to go to work. Both of them have to work, and that means they can't have kids because they're now both working because they can't take time off to devote for the kids. So that's driven it up. But housing is really simple because it's all supply and demand. Housing is about as simple a supply and demand product as you can get. So what would cause things to go to 8 to 12 times income? Migration, people. Now, Australia doesn't produce enough people of its own to support its own population. That is, if you cut off all migration, Australia's population will gradually dwindle, which means the population increase has all been driven by immigration. Now, if you keep bringing people into the market, but you don't supply that adequate number of houses, then there's a higher demand than the supply. But it does another thing as well. It means there's more people in the marketplace for jobs. So it puts pressure to keep the job incomes, the wages, lower. Why should I pay you more? Because get the hell out if you don't like it, because there's another 200 people out that door that'll take the job. So there's pressure. When there's excess people, there's pressure on wages to stay low. If there's no one available for a job, then people, to get someone to work, they start bumping up the prices. But that's not the case when you have a overabundance of migrated people that have come in. But all those people need to live somewhere. So not only does it put pressure on keeping the wages low, it puts pressure on driving the prices up of the housing. So it's a double-edged sword, and it makes things less affordable for the people whose wages are artificially kept low because of the immigration. Now, the government controls the immigration numbers, so always remember that. The people don't control it. The government controls how many people come in. The government controls how much public housing is getting built, and there's been hardly any, if any, new, extra public housing added to the public housing pool. There are new public houses, but they're replacing the old public houses. So I'm talking about the public housing pool getting extra. Now, the government did have a thing, at least in this country, where the private sector could build a house and rent it out to people who were on a certain income or less only. And to rent that house, you had to have your document from this particular body that said you met the requirements. So you wouldn't even be able to go look at the house unless you had that certificate. So you had to apply to that body, show them how much income you made. They made the assessment. Yes, you are below that income threshold. You can go get that house. Now, the house was in the private sector. And what it basically meant, for instance, let's say the dwelling would, in the private market, rent for $400 a week. With the subsidy from the government, it would be done at, say, $320. So you, as the renter, would pay the private landlord $320, and the government would pay them $80. So they're still getting their $400. So instead of the government building public housing, they did it that way. The problem is that's not low enough from the private market, because you could still always find something in the private market that would have been $320 anyway. So there was no benefit to that. It just made people go, well, I'll just get this. Now, the other thing, a couple of other little things, convincing everybody they need to buy a rental for retirement. Now, this becomes a baby boomer issue, right? Every market the baby boomers have been through has exploded, and then as they've left the market's collapsed simply because they're a big swathe of people. So when you have this big baby boomer bunch of people all wanting to own a rental, those rentals mean that people can't own them because the baby boomers are holding on to them as rentals instead of leaving them on the open market for someone else to buy to live in. So that has taken houses out of the buy to live in pool. So you've got the extra migration, you've got the baby boomers and the like. Everyone wants to make money for nothing because they've been convinced they can by the likes of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki. Or you have to buy rentals and rent them out. Now, of course, that's taken those houses off the market for other people. Now, we do need rentals, don't get me wrong about that, but it's an increased number because not everyone can own a rental. Mathematically, it's not possible. Now, to make matters worse, we have Airbnb. Now, I just read two numbers that came out of Australian statistics. One is that in the last 3 years, there were 345 separate dwellings listed for Airbnb in the country. So there's 345,000 things that could have been on the rental market but are not. But there are currently active right now, this very second, 137,000 listings. Now, not all of them will be a house. Some of them might be a little granny flat, but that granny flat could have been rented out to a single person. But now it's not. It's off the rental market. The others are houses and apartments and units and flats and townhouses that are off the rental market for a weekly rent because someone's decided that if they can get 2 nights a week Airbnb out of it, then that beats the hell out of what they can get as a weekly rent. So they'll just put it on the Airbnb market. And if it's only occupied half the time, they don't care because it still makes them more money than if it was a rental. So that has removed supply. Now remember, the real estate's just supply and demand. Now Australia is having this problem. The UK has the exact same problem. The United States, their migration is nearly 1 million a year. They have that problem as well. Now what is that? How do you resolve that? You have to increase the supply. You either stop the people, which is you stop the migration, or you increase the supply. Now, as terms of money flowing through the system, stopping the migration and just letting the system come to equilibrium doesn't put money in the system. So what will is increasing the supply. Now, the government asking the private sector to increase the supply is not going to work because they can only build as much as they can build. And with the supply chains as it is, everything is a little bit haywire anyway. And that's not necessarily going to resolve the problem because the government will just bring more people in. Now, the government building more public housing, low-cost housing. Where's all the low-cost housing? I don't recall the last time I've seen a government adding to the pool of government housing, low-cost housing. I can't recall the last time I've seen it. It's probably 15 or 20 years since anything has been added to the pool of government housing. And what makes it worse is that the government runs programs to sell off the public housing, making the pool of public housing ever smaller and smaller and smaller. It goes into the private sector, and it doesn't matter if they say you can't do anything with it for 10 years, because so what? In 10 years, that person sells it because they get on with their life, and it's a house that's out of the public housing sector and it's gone back into the free market, and the prices go up because of the immigration and all the supply and demand issues going on. Now, one interesting issue is you've got your low-income housing towers. Let's say a 20-story building. It might be a 10-story building. It could be a 6-story building. It doesn't matter how tall it is, as long as it's cheaply done. It's publicly built by the government as cheap as possible. No fancy bells and whistles, nothing elaborate, no marble bench tops, just cheap stuff that people can move into. The government doesn't seem to be interested in doing that. But that would solve a lot of issues. Where do you get the funding for that? Well, the first part of the funding comes from foreign aid. Australia, at least, sends $4 billion a year in foreign aid overseas. Not only could that if 1 year they spent some of that money building low-cost shelters for homeless people. Homelessness overnight, it's done. It gives them a place to stay. But that would only be some of the money. The rest of the money, $4 billion a year going into public housing. That'd be amazing. Low-cost public little high-rises, maybe 6 to 10 stories tall each. They don't have to be 20-story monstrosities. Little 6 to 10-story things, just poke them out a little bit further out where the land is a little bit cheaper. Little supermarket or something out there, and they'll all be happy. That will go a long way to resolving a lot of the crisis that we have in the country. Stop importing the people just to ease the pressure on the demand on that market, and then increase your supply. It can be done if the government has a will.